The chamber of the Galactic Council was wide and full of light that shimmered on the polished floor, and the curved walls that carried the symbols of hundreds of alien worlds, and many believed it was the most important place in the galaxy because here laws were made and wars were stopped and alliances were formed. But on that day the air was heavy and quiet because the Council had gathered to speak about one species that had become too powerful and too independent, and that species was humanity. Ambassador Laura Green stood alone at the center of the chamber, where the light above her was bright and cold, and the faces of the alien delegates looked down at her from their seats that rose in long circles around the floor, and she felt their eyes like a weight pressing down because she knew they had already made their decision before she had even walked in. High Chancellor Urek, a tall and old being with translucent skin and long silver ridges on his head, lifted his voice that echoed across the hall and said that the Council had tolerated human defiance for too long, and that now Earth and its colonies must accept regulation by the Galactic Council, or lose all privileges of trade and travel. And he said that if humanity refused the decree, the Council would impose full sanctions, and might even authorize force. The words fell heavy in the silence, and Laura could hear the faint hum of the translation systems working in the background, as each alien delegate listened in their own language, and she saw small flashes of color from the emotion lights that changed on the consoles of many species as they whispered among themselves and nodded with agreement and confidence. She waited until the Chancellor was done, and then she spoke in a calm voice that carried through the hall because she did not need to shout for everyone to hear her, and she said that the Terran Empire was not under the rule of the Council and that humans would not accept threats or demands because they had earned their place among the stars by their own strength and sacrifice. And she told them that humanity would choose its own path and not bow again to the old powers that thought they still controlled everything. A murmur moved through the chamber, and many delegates turned away or shook their heads, and a few laughed softly, thinking the human ambassador was only pretending to be strong, and that Earth would soon realize its mistake and come crawling back. The Chancellor looked down at her with eyes that reflected the light like glass and said that defiance would bring suffering to billions of her people, and he asked if she wanted that responsibility on her hands, and Laura stood straight and said that the responsibility would belong to those who forced an empire to defend itself. Then she turned and walked out of the chamber while the Council called for a vote, and she did not look back because she knew how it would end. When she reached the shuttle platform outside the hall, she looked up at the great window that showed the stars beyond the city dome, and she thought about home and about the quiet blue light of Earth, and she sent a single coded message through her secure line to the Terran command. The message was short, but its meaning was vast and clear, and it said that the Council had made its move, and that the time for patience was over. On Earth, the message arrived within minutes, and was received by the Terran Intelligence Network, which sent it to the President's office in New Washington, where President Daniel Ross read it without expression, and then handed it to his military advisor, who only nodded because they had both expected this moment for years. In orbit above the planet Luna, Admiral Ryan Cole stood on the bridge of the battleship TIS Resolute and watched the dark side of the Earth slowly pass under them. And when his console beeped with the encoded transmission, he read the few lines of text and then looked out at the stars again and said quietly that the Council had finally drawn the line. The officers around him were silent because everyone on that bridge knew what would come next, and they also knew that the Terran Empire had been ready for this since the day the Council first tried to limit human expansion. Far across the system, on Mars, the industrial sectors were already moving into high alert, and the shipyards that had been working quietly for years began to shift into full production as orders came through to finish every hull and arm every ship that could move. On Titan, engineers in cold suits worked around the clock to prepare the new generation of warships that had been built in secret under the name of exploration vessels, and each one of them carried power systems that the Council's scientists had declared impossible. Humanity had been underestimated for too long, and now the Empire's true strength was beginning to awaken. Meanwhile, on the Council world of Virith, Chancellor Urek met privately with his advisors, who believed that the ultimatum would force humanity to bend within days because no single species could stand against the combined power of the Council's member fleets, and they argued that if humans resisted, they could be crushed quickly to set an example for others who might forget. The authority of the Council But there were a few voices who warned that humans were not like the others, and that they had a history of doing what everyone thought they could not do. And one of them was a young diplomat named Lurian, who said that pushing them might be a mistake that could burn half the spiral arm. But no one listened to him because they all believed in their superiority and experience. In the quiet of her quarters aboard her shuttle, Laura Green received a response from Earth confirming her transmission, and she sat there for a long time, looking at the small display that showed only a single word, which was acknowledged. She closed her eyes and felt both relief and fear because she loved her people, but she also knew that what was coming would change everything forever, and that after this there would be no going back to peace and easy trust. On Earth, the news spread slowly at first and then faster as rumors grew about the Council's threat, and about how the Terran fleets were preparing, and people on the streets talked about war, and some were afraid while others were proud, because they said it was time for humanity to stand up for itself. Factories that had once built ships for trade now built armor plating and weapons, and young pilots lined up to join the defense forces, because everyone knew that this was no longer about a single world, but about every human colony and every settlement that carried the flag of the Terran Empire. President Ross looked out of his office window at the long night sky filled with the lights of the orbital stations, and he thought about how far humanity had come from the days when they first looked at the stars with wonder and hope, and he knew that now the galaxy looked back at them with fear. The decision had been made and no amount of talk could change it, and in that silence before the storm the Terran Empire stood ready not as aggressors, but as a people who would never kneel again. Admiral Ryan Cole stood on the observation deck of the Terran Command Center that floated above Titan, and below him thousands of workers moved between ships like ants, glowing lights from their suits flashing against the silver hulls that filled the vast docks that stretched for miles, and every ship carried the mark of the Terran Empire, a white star on a deep blue background that stood for unity and strength and hope. He had served for more than 30 years in the Navy, and had seen humanity grow from a scattered collection of colonies into a force that could match the ancient powers of the galaxy. And as he watched the fleets move into new formations, he knew that history was turning its page again. In his hand he held the order from President Daniel Ross that told him to begin full mobilization, but to avoid open fire unless the Council broke the peace first, and those words sounded calm. But he knew they were the final signal that war was no longer just possible, but certain. Down in the command bay, officers called out reports as engines roared, and reactors came online, and communication screens filled with the faces of captains across the system waiting for instructions, and Ryan Cole told them to stand ready and maintain silence because every move now mattered. On the surface of Earth, President Ross was meeting with the Defense Council inside the underground base known as Atlas I, and around the table were the heads of the Navy, the Army and intelligence, and their screens showed the movement of ships, satellites and colonies in every sector of space that humanity controlled, and they knew the Council could strike from anywhere and at any time. General Laura Price spoke first, saying that they could not wait forever, and that it would be better to move first to secure the outer colonies before the Council fleets arrived. But the president shook his head because he wanted to keep the moral ground by not starting the war, and he said that humanity must be ready, but must not become the aggressor. In the Council capital on Virith, the alien delegates celebrated quietly, thinking that the humans would soon come to beg for negotiation once their trade lines were cut, because the Council had already ordered a blockade around the Vega corridor, where many Terran ships passed through, and they believed that would bring the humans to their knees. But Admiral Cole already knew about it before it began, because Terran intelligence had intercepted their coded signals, and he had already sent the Fourth Fleet under Admiral Megan Ortiz to the Vega corridor, where they waited in the dark behind the shadow of a gas giant with engines cold and lights off so that no scanners could find them. Megan Ortiz was young but had earned her rank through skill and boldness, and her ship, the TS Guardian, was known across the Empire as one that had never lost a battle, and she stood on her bridge with calm eyes as she watched the empty space where the Council fleets would soon appear. When the alien ships arrived, they formed a wide circle around the Vega corridor, their hulls shining with the marks of 5 great species that had long dominated the galaxy, and they broadcast a message saying that all Terran ships must submit to inspection and surrender control of their cargo routes. No answer came for several minutes, and the alien commanders began to laugh and relax, thinking that the humans were afraid to respond. But then their sensors began to flicker, and static filled their channels because something massive had just come out of the shadow behind the gas giant. The Terran fleet emerged in perfect silence, its ships black and sharp like blades cutting through the void, and every cannon was already locked and charged, and before the Council fleets could adjust their positions, the space between them lit up in a storm of light. In less than 15 minutes, the blockade fleets were gone, only fragments of metal, and silence remained drifting in the dark, and the Terran ships moved away, leaving a single beacon behind that flashed a message saying the Terran Empire does not bow. On Titan, Admiral Cole received the report, and his face showed no joy and no anger, only calm because he had expected it to happen, and he said that now the Council would have no choice but to act, and that the time of hiding was over. In his private cabin, he opened a file that contained the record of Earth's long history with the Council, from the days when humans had begged for membership to the day they were granted it, and then treated as children, and he remembered the insults and restrictions the Council had placed on human science and expansion, and he knew those years were gone forever. On Vireth, the news reached the Council within hours, and chaos broke out among the delegates as they shouted and blamed each other, because no one had expected that the humans could strike so fast and with such precision, and some called for immediate retaliation while others demanded negotiation before the humans destroyed another fleet. Chancellor Urek stood before them and tried to bring order, but even he could feel fear moving through the chamber, because if the humans could do this to 5 combined fleets, then there was no safe corner left in the galaxy. Ambassador Laura Green, who was still on Vireth, watched the panic from her embassy window, and she felt both sadness and pride because she had warned them that threatening humanity was a mistake. And now they were learning that truth the hard way. Back on Earth, President Ross met with his advisors again, and they all knew that the Council would now move faster and harder, but he told them that no matter what happened, they must never lose sight of who they were, and that the Empire must stand for protection and not for conquest, because once they became like the Council, they would lose the very thing that made them human. In the following days, the Terran fleets began to move to defensive positions across the colonies, and civilians were evacuated from outer stations, while engineers worked day and night to finish new weapons and shields that had been kept secret for years. Young cadets trained in simulators that showed the endless stars, and commanders drilled their crews until every order was followed without hesitation, because they knew the real war would not be fought in days, but in years, and only those who stood united would survive. On the edge of the known space, the Terran scouts discovered that several Council fleets were gathering in the Larnus sector near human borders, and reports came that the Council was preparing a massive strike to break the Empire's power once and for all. But no one in the Empire showed fear because they had already accepted that the age of peace was gone. In his office, Admiral Cole looked at a small photograph of his family taken long ago before he left Earth for the last time, and he whispered that he would do everything to keep them safe, and that no Council fleet would ever touch their world again. The Terran Empire stood on the edge of something new and dangerous, but also something proud, because for the first time in centuries they were not running or pleading, they were standing tall as equals, and even if the galaxy burned, they would not kneel. The stars over the Larnus sector were quiet, but the silence was full of tension because both the Terran Empire and the Galactic Council knew that this place would decide what happened next, and the fleets of both sides waited hidden behind planets and moons and gas clouds, each watching the other and waiting for the first move. Admiral Megan Ortiz stood on the bridge of her flagship, the Tias Guardian, and her face was calm, though her heart beat hard in her chest because she knew that soon they might be fighting not for one battle, but for the survival of their people. And she looked at her officers, who were young and serious, and she felt proud because they were ready. The Council fleets were larger in number, but their ships were older and slower, and their captains were used to fighting pirates and rebels, not a force that could match them in skill and power. And Megan knew that was the one thing that gave the Terran fleet a chance. She remembered the day she had joined the Navy when the Terran Empire was still rebuilding after years of tension with the Council, and she had believed that peace would last. But now she knew that peace only lasted until someone stronger refused to be controlled. The command center was filled with soft lights and voices as officers reported new signals from the enemy side, and one young officer said that the Council had sent a message ordering them to surrender or face destruction, and Megan smiled because it was the same arrogance she had seen before. She ordered the communication officer to open the channel, and she said in a steady voice that the Terran Empire would not surrender, and that if the Council wanted to test their strength, they were welcome to do so. And then she told him to cut the line. Across the sector, the Council commanders hesitated because they had hoped that the humans would retreat, or at least try to negotiate, but instead they received only silence after that, and that silence was louder than any threat. In the war room, on Earth, President Daniel Ross and Admiral Ryan Cole watched the live data from the Larnus sector appear on their screens as red and blue lights, and they knew that once the first weapon fired, there would be no going back. And the President asked the Admiral if humanity was ready, and the Admiral said that they were ready and that they would not fall. In the Council capital, the delegates argued again and again, because some wanted to end the conflict before it grew worse, while others demanded revenge for the loss at Vega, and the Chancellor tried to calm them. But he too was afraid because messages from the front line said that human ships had begun to surround the Council's fleets, and their sensors could not even detect how the Terran ships were moving. In the dark of the Larnus system, the battle began when a single Council cruiser fired a warning shot that missed its mark, and in the next instant, the space between the two forces exploded with light as both sides opened fire, and hundreds of ships moved in every direction, and the stars vanished behind the glow of plasma fire and missile trails. The Terran ships moved with precision and speed that seemed impossible, and every strike they made hit exactly where it was needed, because their targeting systems used quantum tracking that no other race had mastered, and the Council ships tried to respond, but their lines broke quickly as confusion spread among them. Megan stood at the center of her bridge, giving orders one after another, and her voice stayed calm, even as the ship shook from enemy fire. And when one of her cruisers took a heavy hit, she ordered another ship to cover its retreat, because every life mattered and she would not throw her people away even in victory. Back on Titan, Admiral Cole received real-time updates and watched as the Council fleets began to collapse, and he said to his staff that this was not just a battle, but a message to the entire galaxy that humanity would not be ruled anymore, and his words spread through the communication network to every Terran base and every colony where people were listening. For hours, the battle raged across the sector, until the last Council battleship exploded in silence, and the Terran fleet stood alone among the debris of what had once been the strongest military power of the galaxy. And when the dust settled, the stars came back into view again as if the universe itself had been holding its breath. When the reports reached Earth, there was no cheering or celebration, because everyone knew that this was not the end but only the beginning. And President Ross gave a speech to the people saying that the Empire had defended its freedom, but that they must be ready for what would come next because the Council would not forgive or forget. On Virith, the Council chamber was in chaos again, and many delegates shouted that they must strike with all their power to destroy humanity before they grew stronger, while others said that they should open peace talks before the Terran fleets reached their borders, but no one could agree. And the Chancellor said that the galaxy was changing, and that the old order was falling apart. Ambassador Laura Green was still there watching from the shadows of her quarters as the Council leaders argued, and she sent quiet messages to Earth reporting everything she saw and warning that some members were now preparing to break away from the Council because they feared the humans more than the Chancellor himself. Far away in deep space, the Terran engineers tested new ships built with the technology that had once been banned by the Council, and they spoke of things like warp phase drives and living hulls that could heal themselves and artificial minds that could control fleets faster than any organic being could think. And these were things humanity had kept secret for a long time, waiting for the right moment to use them. Admiral Cole walked through the command decks of the shipyard looking at the workers, and he thought that every bolt and every wire they built was a statement that said humanity had survived and would keep surviving, and he felt the weight of every life that depended on his choices, but he did not show it because leaders could not afford to show fear. On the colony world of Elysia, families watched the sky as Terran patrols flew overhead, and children waved at the ships because they had grown up hearing stories about the old Council that treated humans as lesser. And now they could see that their people were free and strong, and even though war was near, they felt proud instead of afraid. Megan Ortiz stood on the bridge of her ship again after the battle and looked at the wreckage drifting in the dark, and she said to herself that victory always came with a price, and she ordered her crew to recover any survivors even from the enemy ships because she would not let anyone die alone in the void. and her crew obeyed because they knew their admiral had honor. As the Terran fleets returned to their bases, the galaxy began to change because many smaller worlds and species that had once been afraid of the Council started to reach out to humanity, asking for protection or alliance, and the Empire listened, carefully, because they did not want to become conquerors but protectors. In the deep halls of the Council capital, Chancellor Urek sat alone after the assembly had ended, and he looked out at the stars through the great dome of glass above him, and for the first time he understood that the age of the Council was ending, and that the humans had done what no one thought possible. They had broken the fear that held the galaxy together, and replaced it with something new. On Earth, President Ross met with his advisors again and told them that they must prepare for peace as much as for war, because if they destroyed the Council completely, they would only take its place. And he said that humanity must show the galaxy that strength could also mean mercy, and that freedom must be shared, not imposed. Admiral Cole looked at the map of the stars that stretched across the command room wall, and he thought that the future would be harder than any war, because now the Empire had to prove it deserved the power it had taken, and he knew that the eyes of every world were watching. In the silence of space between the stars, the Terran fleets moved like shadows carrying the promise of a new age, and the memory of every battle that had led them there, and somewhere far beyond what any scanner could reach, the unknown waited quietly as humanity stepped forward into its destiny, one ship at a time. The galaxy was quiet for a moment, but the quiet was only the pause before the storm, because the Council had learned its lesson, and they were gathering every fleet, every ship, and every weapon they could control to respond to humanity and on. Earth, the Terran Empire watched through long-range scanners, and every officer knew that this was the moment when preparation would meet reality, and history would be written in fire and light. President Daniel Ross stood on the balcony of the Capitol Tower looking at the dark sky above the Earth and the lights of satellites orbiting silently, and he felt the weight of every decision he had made, and knew that every human life depended on the choices of those in command, and yet he felt no fear, only determination, because humanity had survived worse before, and now it would survive again. Admiral Ryan Cole walked through the main deck of the TIS Resolute, checking every system and every crew member, because he knew that in space, the smallest failure could become disaster, and his voice was steady as he gave orders and reassured his team, and the younger officers followed him without hesitation, because they trusted his experience and his calm. On Titan, the shipyards were working without pause as new cruisers, frigates, and carriers came off the assembly lines, and every hull was painted with the Terran colors, and every weapon calibrated and tested, because the Empire would not face the Council unprepared, and the engineers who worked day and night did so with pride, because they knew their work would protect billions of lives. The Council fleets were already moving through the warp corridors, and they sent messages demanding surrender and obedience, and the Chancellor warned the delegates that humanity could not be underestimated again, but many of them ignored him because their pride was stronger than their fear, and they believed that overwhelming numbers would crush the humans easily. Admiral Megan Ortiz was stationed in the outer system near the Solana cluster, and she watched the approaching Council fleets through her sensors, and she knew that they were faster and more numerous, but she also knew that the Terran ships had better shields, faster engines, and crews that had trained for years for this moment, and she reminded her team that their skill and courage were their greatest weapons. In orbit above Mars, Colonel Jason Reed oversaw the movement of troops and cargo, and his orders were clear. Every colony must be reinforced and every supply line secured, because the Council would strike at any weakness, and no human settlement could be allowed to fall. And as he gave commands, he could hear the engines of the transport ships humming as they carried soldiers and equipment to distant outposts. In the Council capital, the delegates argued again, because some wanted to attack immediately, while others wanted to wait for a diplomatic solution. But the Chancellor reminded them that time had already been lost, and that the humans were not afraid, and some younger delegates whispered that the Terran Empire had grown too strong, and that the galaxy might never see them as a threat again, but they were ignored because the Council had never dealt with a species like this before. Back on Earth, President Ross met with his intelligence chiefs, who showed him data about alien war plans and fleet movements, and every chart and map was filled with red dots representing enemy ships and blue dots for human fleets, and he said that even if the Council tried to crush them, the Empire would survive because they had prepared for every possible attack, and even for attacks no one could imagine. In the middle of space, Admiral Cole received a message from Megan Ortiz saying that the first Council fleets were entering the perimeter, and he replied that all ships must hold position and fire only if attacked, because the humans would not be the first to start the war, and every captain confirmed that they understood and prepared their weapons in silence. As the Council ships moved closer, the Terran scouts reported every movement, and the Terran fleets shifted silently in formation like a shadow surrounding the intruders. And when the Council saw them, they assumed the humans were fewer than they actually were, and they laughed, thinking that the Terran Empire was bluffing once again, and that their pride would lead them to victory. Suddenly, the Terran ships moved with perfect coordination, striking at weak points and disabling engines and weapons without destroying lives wherever possible, and the Council commanders were shocked because every move seemed planned and executed faster than they could react, and their formations began to break under pressure they did not understand. Admiral Ortiz coordinated her squadrons with calm precision, giving orders that flowed from one ship to another, and she reminded her crew that they fought for freedom, not revenge, and every officer followed her instructions with complete trust. And every shot they fired weakened the enemy's confidence more than their ships. On Earth, the President addressed the people with a calm voice and said that the Terran Empire did not seek conquest, but that it would defend every world and every citizen from anyone who tried to impose control, and his words were broadcast to every colony, and every ship and people everywhere felt a sense of pride and security, because they knew their leaders would not fail. Meanwhile, the Council fleets tried to reorganize and concentrate their fire, but the Terran ships moved faster than anticipated, creating new positions and cutting off escape routes, and every Council commander began to realize that humanity had planned this war for years and had waited for the right moment to show its strength and skill. And for the first time, the delegates feared that they had underestimated an enemy they had once considered weak. Admiral Cole watched the reports come in, and he knew that this was a victory of preparation and training, not just weapons and numbers, and he reminded his officers that every life saved and every ship preserved mattered more than any victory in the records, because the Terran Empire would rise stronger only if its people survived and trusted each other. In the Council capital, some delegates began to call for peace, while others shouted for war, and the Chancellor tried to mediate. But even he realized that the humans had shifted the balance of power, and no amount of argument could change the fact that the Empire would not submit again, and that the galaxy would never see them as inferior. In the outer colonies, civilians watched as Terran patrols passed overhead, and young pilots waved from small shuttles, while engineers worked on upgrades, and every colony prepared for what might come next. And even though fear was present, there was also pride, because they were part of a people who would not kneel to anyone. President Ross held a meeting with Admiral Cole and Colonel Reed, and they agreed that the Empire would show restraint but not weakness, and that they would defend every colony and trade route and ship, and that any attempt to challenge them would be met with the full power of the Empire. And yet they also planned for alliances with those who wished peace and freedom, because the Terran Empire was not built on fear, but on trust and honor. In the empty space between the fleets, the stars seemed calm and distant, but every officer knew that soon the silence would end, and that the galaxy was watching as the humans showed that they could fight, survive, and protect everything they had built, and that no one could force them to bow or obey. Admiral Ortiz looked out from her bridge at the distant lights of the Council fleets and said quietly that they had shown the galaxy that humans could not be underestimated, and her crew felt a quiet pride, because they had lived through the moment that would be remembered for generations, and even if the war continued, they knew that they had proven themselves. On Earth, President Ross spoke again, reminding everyone that the war was not yet over, but that humanity had taken the first step in proving that they could stand alone, strong, and free. And as he spoke, the people listened and knew that the Empire was prepared, and that the future belonged to those who were brave, smart, and united. The galaxy watched as the Terran Empire moved forward, not as a single fleet, but as a united people whose ships and colonies were linked by trust, training, and determination. And from the orbit of Earth to the distant edges of the colonies, every officer, soldier, and civilian knew that history was being written in the stars, and that no one could ignore humanity again. Admiral Ryan Cole stood on the bridge of the TIS, resolute, looking at the data from every sector, and he saw not only the remnants of the Council fleets, but also the new routes being opened by the Terran forces, and he knew that every step taken now would define the empire for decades to come, and he reminded his officers that caution and honor must guide their actions, even as power flowed through their hands. President Daniel Ross addressed the colonies over the comm channels and said that the Terran Empire did not seek war for pleasure or conquest, but would protect every world, every ship and every citizen from anyone who tried to force them to obey, and his words echoed across light years and inspired hope in some and fear in others, because humans had shown they could defend themselves against the galaxy's strongest powers. On Titan, the shipyards were still active as engineers prepared new classes of ships designed for speed, defense, and endurance, and every crew member understood that the Terran Empire was no longer bound by the limits that the Council had once imposed, and that the galaxy itself was now a place where humans would set the rules for themselves and for those who wished to align with them. Admiral Megan Ortiz led her squadrons through patrols near the borders of known space, and her crews maintained perfect discipline because they knew that every ship represented not only firepower but also the hope and pride of billions of humans. And she reminded them that their mission was protection, not domination, and that honor must guide every decision. In the council capital, panic had spread among the delegates because they could not understand how a species they had once thought inferior had defeated their fleets with speed, intelligence, and precision, and some members whispered that the council itself was no longer the strongest force in the galaxy, while others blamed themselves and their arrogance for underestimating humanity. Ambassador Laura Green observed the chaos quietly from her post and sent careful reports back to Earth, detailing which delegates were fearful and which were still determined to strike, and she knew that her information would help the Empire make decisions that could prevent unnecessary loss while strengthening humanity's position across the stars. Colonel Jason Reed coordinated defenses on the outer colonies, making sure that every outpost had supplies, communications, and trained personnel, and he walked through the stations, checking that every soldier understood their orders and that every civilian knew how to stay safe, because the Council might attempt another strike or sabotage, but the Terran Empire would not be caught unprepared again. The Council attempted to negotiate through back channels, sending messages that offered peace if the humans would withdraw from disputed sectors and return to Council oversight. But the Terran leadership rejected these offers firmly and clearly, sending a response that said the Empire would decide its own course and no one else would dictate its actions. And this message spread across the galaxy like wildfire, changing the perception of humanity in every system. On Earth, President Ross met with his advisors in the High Command, and he said that strength alone was not enough, that they must also show fairness and restraint, and that the Terran Empire must be remembered not as conquerors, but as protectors and leaders whose authority came from capability and integrity. And the advisors nodded because they had seen what humanity could do, and they trusted the president's judgment completely. Across the colonies, people looked up at the sky and watched the Terran patrols move like shadows across the stars, and children waved at the ships, learning for the first time that humanity was not powerless, that the stories of old weakness were gone, and that the Empire's presence meant safety and pride. And for the first time, many worlds that had lived in fear now felt hope and belonging. In the middle of space, Admiral Cole reviewed reports from intelligence scouts who had discovered smaller alien factions that were considering alliances with humanity now because they saw that the Empire had proven itself capable of defending not only its own people, but also those who chose to trust them. And he instructed his officers to open careful communications, offering protection and partnership but never domination, because the Empire must remain honorable and strong. Admiral Ortiz prepared her fleet for a demonstration of strength, sending squadrons to move in coordinated maneuvers that were visible to Council outposts, but without firing a single shot, showing that humanity could strike if necessary, but preferred control through presence and respect. And her crew watched as the Council ships observed silently, clearly shaken by the display of discipline and power. In the Council capital, the delegates argued endlessly because some wanted to continue fighting while others suggested surrender or long-term negotiation, and even the Chancellor understood that humanity had shifted the balance and that any attempt to return to the old order would fail, and whispers ran through the corridors that the galaxy had changed and the humans would never again be treated as children or weaklings. Ambassador Laura Green sent reports noting which Council Members were willing to reconsider their pride and which were likely to continue plotting against humanity, and these messages helped the President and admirals to plan next steps carefully, ensuring that every decision would strengthen the Empire's position while avoiding unnecessary casualties. In orbit above Mars, Colonel Reed oversaw training exercises where young recruits practiced defending stations, piloting new ships and coordinating with older crews, and the drills were intense but necessary because the Terran Empire could not allow overconfidence to weaken their readiness even after a great victory, and every soldier learned to value discipline, teamwork, and respect for orders. On Earth, President Ross addressed the public again and reminded them that while humanity had shown its strength, responsibility came with that strength, and the Empire's role was not to dominate but to protect. And his words inspired confidence across the colonies because people knew that their leaders understood both power and restraint, and that they would not misuse the victory they had earned. In deep space, the Terran fleets continued to patrol borders, maintain communications, and train for any challenge because they knew that other powers might be watching, waiting, and testing. And Admiral Cole reminded everyone that humanity's example would now shape the galaxy, and that every action they took must be careful, deliberate, and guided by the values that had allowed them to survive and rise. On Titan, engineers finalized a new line of ships capable of faster travel, stronger defense, and advanced communication, and these ships represented both technological achievement and the Empire's determination to stay ahead of any threat, and every engineer took pride in knowing that their work protected not just ships but the lives of millions across the stars. Across the colonies, people celebrated quietly, feeling safe and proud because humanity had proven itself against impossible odds, and they looked at the stars knowing that the Terran Empire was no longer a minor power, but a force that would command respect, and that the galaxy must now reckon with their presence and skill. The Council capital, the Chancellor met with advisors and acknowledged that the humans had taught the galaxy an important lesson, and that for the first time the Council could not rely on fear alone, and some delegates admitted that respect for humanity was now unavoidable, and that future interactions would be shaped by this display of courage, skill, and determination. Ambassador Laura Green prepared her final reports from the Council and sent them securely to Earth, detailing the reactions of every delegate and the steps the Council was likely to take in the future. And she knew that the information would guide the Empire in decisions that could secure peace and strength for decades, ensuring that humanity would remain unchallenged by anyone who underestimated them. President Ross and Admiral Cole stood together, looking at the maps of space, at the positions of fleets, and at the colonies, and they knew that the galaxy had changed forever, because humans had proven that they would not bow, that they would not be ruled, and that they had the courage, skill, and unity to protect everything they had built and everything they would build in the future. And with that knowledge, they prepared for the next era, knowing that the Terran Empire had truly arrived as a power the galaxy could no longer ignore.